The fire had burned low in the stone hearth, casting long amber shadows across the timber walls of the old ranch house. Outside, the wind carried the first breath of Montana winter across the fields, rattling the shutters and singing through the pines that stood guard around the homestead. It was the autumn of 1920, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, 62 years old, sat in his father's rocking chair, with a cold pipe between his fingers and nearly 3 decades of memory pressing against his chest. Across from him, his grandson leaned forward on the wooden bench, elbows on his knees, eyes bright with the kind of hunger only the young possess. Caleb Hawthorne was 17 years old, lean and strong as a young pine, and tomorrow morning he would board a westbound train for Oregon. There was a sheep ranch waiting for him there, owned by an old family friend, and with it the beginning of his own story. But tonight belonged to another story. "Tell me, Grandpa," Caleb said, his voice softer than the wind outside. "Before I go, tell me how you met Grandma. Everyone says it was something out of a book, but nobody tells it the way you would." The old man smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. He turned his head toward the window, where lamplight spilled across the yard. Out there beyond the glass, he could see Clara. She was 51 years old now. Her honey blonde hair streaked with silver, but her laugh still carried across a room like music. She was helping their daughter-in-law gather apples from the orchard. Her round cheeks flushed pink from the cold, and even after 29 years, the sight of her stopped his breath. It started on a Tuesday morning. Nathaniel said, his voice low and steady as a river. In the spring of 1891, I was 33 years old, and I had not spoken to a woman in 10 long years. He struck a match, relit his pipe, and the smoke curled upward like a door opening into the past. The Cedar Falls church had been built in 1876 by hands that were long since buried. Its timber walls had weathered silver. Its stained glass windows caught the morning light and threw it across the packed wooden pews in broken rainbows. On that spring Tuesday, not one seat remained empty. Farmers in their Sunday coats sat shoulder to shoulder with shopkeepers and ranchers. Women fanned themselves with folded hymnals against the growing heat. Children squirmed and were shushed. The air was thick with sweat and perfume and something else, something darker that had no name but tasted like shame on the tongue. In the front pew sat Harold Pemberton, 53 years old, banker and landowner, and the wealthiest man in 3 counties. He wore a black suit tailored in Chicago, a gold watch chain looped across his vest, and an expression of quiet satisfaction. His pale fingers were steepled before him, and he watched the altar the way a spider watches a fly caught in its web. On the altar stood 3 young women in borrowed white dresses. The first was 16 years old. Her name was Sarah Morrison, and tears ran down her cheeks in silent streams, while her mother gripped her wrist tight enough to leave bruises. Sarah's father had died 6 months earlier, owing money that had somehow appeared on Pemberton's ledgers only after the old man was in the ground. The second woman was a widow in her 30s, her hands calloused from working land that had been taken from her piece by piece, her eyes hollow from understanding exactly what was happening and being powerless to stop it. And the third was Clara Whitmore. She was 22 years old, and she stood with her shoulders back and her chin lifted in a way that made the crowd murmur. Her honey blonde hair had been pinned up in an elaborate style that did not suit her. The borrowed wedding dress hung wrong on her full figure, too tight across the bust, too loose at the waist. Her round face, soft and sweet and flushed pink with barely controlled fear, was the kind of face that belonged in Boston parlors teaching piano to rich men's daughters. Not here, not on this auction block. Because that was what it was, no matter what prettier name the pulpit preacher gave it. In her hands, Clara clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers, and hidden beneath the bouquet, her knuckles had gone white. Around her neck hung a small silver cross worn by her skin, and the only thing she had left of a mother who had died when she was 10 years old. She pressed her lips together and fixed her eyes on a crack in the rafters above the congregation. Because if she looked down, if she looked at the faces of the men bidding, she was going to break. She was not going to break. Not here, not in front of these people. 6 months earlier, her father had been alive. Reverend Josiah Whitmore, a quiet Protestant minister with kind eyes and gentle hands, had come home from evening prayers complaining of chest pains. By morning, he was gone. The doctor called it a heart attack, wrote the certificate, patted Clara's shoulder, and told her he was sorry. And then the letters had started arriving. Debts, obligations, loans her father had allegedly taken out that Clara had never heard of. $3,000 all told, owed to a Montana bank belonging to a certain Mr. Harold Pemberton. When Pemberton himself appeared on her Boston doorstep 2 months later, so full of sympathy and gentlemanly concern, Clara had been too numb to see the snake beneath the suit. He spoke of a fresh start. He spoke of a respectable Montana family seeking a bride through correspondence, a widower of means, a new life far from the grief and the debt. Clara had sold her mother's piano to pay for the train ticket west, packed a single trunk, and boarded the Great Northern Railway with a hope so fragile it might have been made of glass. That hope had shattered the moment she stepped onto the platform at Cedar Falls and discovered that there was no respectable widower waiting. Only Pemberton. Only the debt. Only his cold smile and his patient eyes. He had kept her at the boarding house for 3 weeks while arrangements were made. He had explained over and over in that same reasonable voice that the only way she could discharge her father's debt was to marry a man wealthy enough to absorb it. And as luck would have it, Pemberton was such a man. He was going to let the town bid first, for appearances, for the theater of it. And when no one could match the price, he would rise from his pew like the hero of his own story, announce that he himself would take on her burden and claim her for his third wife. He had buried 2 already. Clara knew. Everyone knew, and no one had moved to help her. On the altar, she closed her eyes for the briefest moment and spoke to her mother wherever she was. "Mama," she whispered in her mind, please send me a way out. I cannot do this. I am not strong enough for this." And somewhere perhaps her mother heard. Father Mackenzie, the old priest, stood at the pulpit with sweat darkening his collar, reading from a script Pemberton had written. His voice shook, and more than once his eyes flicked to the banker in the front pew, with an expression that might have been shame or might have been fear. In Cedar Falls, those 2 things had a way of looking the same. The bidding for Sarah Morrison was swift and brutal. A rancher named Hewitt, 45 years old and twice her size, stood up and claimed her with the flat announcement of a man buying a horse. Her mother finally let go of her wrist. Sarah walked down the aisle on her new husband's arm, still weeping silently, and the crowd pretended not to see. The widow went next, purchased by a shopkeeper who needed someone to raise his children. There was at least a small mercy in his eyes. It was not much, but in a merciless morning, small mercies were all anyone had. Then it was Clara's turn. Pemberton rose from his pew, adjusted his cuffs, and stepped forward with the practiced grace of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mirror. He smiled at the congregation, and several people smiled back without thinking, because Harold Pemberton held notes on half the houses in this town. "Miss Clara Whitmore," he announced, drawing her name out like a sommelier savoring wine, "daughter of the late Reverend Josiah Whitmore of Boston, educated in the finest schools of the East, accomplished in music, literature, and the gentle arts. A rare flower indeed, who finds herself burdened with certain unfortunate debts left by her late father." He paused. He let the silence stretch. He wanted the townspeople to understand without having to say it directly that the price would be high and that only one man present could pay it. "Surely," Pemberton continued, "some gentleman here today recognizes the opportunity before him." No one spoke. No one was fool enough to bid against Harold Pemberton. The silence lengthened and Clara's chin began to tremble just slightly, just enough that only someone watching for it would have noticed. She forced it still. She forced her breathing steady. She pictured her father, and she prayed, and she waited for the hammer to fall. And that was when the doors of the church exploded open. Not the gentle creak of a latecomer slipping in, not the soft murmur of apology. The heavy oak doors slammed backward against the timber walls with a crack like a rifle shot, and every soul in that congregation turned as one. 3 men stood in the doorway. 3 mountain men. The oldest stood in front. He was 6 feet and 8 inches of weathered muscle and hard bone, dressed in buckskin and dark wool, his shoulders wide enough to fill the church door. His hair was brown as tree bark, his beard neatly trimmed, and his eyes, when the light caught them, were the color of amber whiskey held up to a lamp. He carried himself with the stillness of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was only waiting for the moment to do it. Behind his right shoulder stood the second, only a fraction shorter. His hair was a tangled chestnut sun-streaked at the tips, and his eyes were a warmer shade of brown closer to honey. There was laughter buried somewhere in his face, the kind that had been put away for a long time but had not been forgotten. His hands, large and calloused, hung loose and ready at his sides. Behind the left shoulder stood the third, the youngest, and in some ways the most frightening. He was 6'5", golden-haired, and his eyes were a pale amber so bright they looked almost yellow in the light from the stained glass. His hand rested easy on the butt of a Colt revolver at his hip, and the easy way it rested told you everything you needed to know about how fast that hand could move. Someone in the crowd whispered a name, and the whisper traveled like fire across dry grass. The Hawthorne brothers, the beasts of Elkhorn Ridge. Clara did not know the name, but she saw the reaction it caused. She saw farmers cross themselves. She saw a woman 3 pews from the front clutch her child closer. She saw Harold Pemberton's smile falter for the first time that morning, a small crack running down the center of his composed face. The 3 men began to walk down the center aisle. They did not hurry. They did not need to. The crowd parted in front of them the way tall grass parts before a summer wind, and their boots made a steady, deliberate sound on the timber floor. Clara watched them come, and somewhere beneath her terror, something else began to stir. Not hope exactly, something older than hope. The feeling perhaps of a prayer being answered in a language she did not yet understand. Harold Pemberton stepped out of his pew to block their path. "This is a private ceremony," he said, and his voice was tight. "You gentlemen have no business here." The oldest of the 3 men did not even look at him. He stepped around Pemberton as though the banker were a fence post, and he kept walking until he reached the altar steps. There at last he stopped. He looked up at Clara. For a long moment he did not speak. He simply looked. And Clara, staring down into those pale gold eyes, felt something inside her that had been locked for a long time begin to shift. She saw the beast the town had named him. She saw the scars on his hands, the weather on his face, the tension in his jaw. But beneath it all, beneath the muscle and the stillness and the dangerous quiet, she saw loneliness. She saw a man who had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what another human being's kindness felt like. He saw her, too. He saw the round, sweet face, the honey hair, the terrified dignity. He saw the wild flowers clutched so tight, her knuckles had gone bone white. He saw the silver cross at her throat catching the light. And he saw, most of all, the way she refused to look away from him, even though every instinct in her body must have been telling her to. "I have not seen a woman," he said, and his voice was deep and low and roughened by 10 years of near silence. "In 10 years, and I do not think God will forgive me if I stand by and let this one be sold like cattle in a pen." The church went so quiet you could hear the candles burning. Clara's lips parted. She did not know what to say. She did not know what this man intended. She only knew that his voice had steadied something inside her that had been trembling for a very long time. He climbed the 3 steps of the altar in one motion. He was close now, so close she had to tilt her head back to look at him, and she could smell the pine sap and wood smoke on his clothes, the clean, cold scent of the high country. He reached up with one enormous calloused hand and cupped the side of her face, and his touch was so gentle that tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. And then he leaned down and he kissed her. It was not a long kiss. It was not a demanding kiss. It was the kiss of a man making a promise before God and witnesses a promise that said, "I will stand between you and the world from this day forward if you will have me." His lips were warm and chapped from the mountain wind. Hers trembled just once and then held still. When he drew back, Clara was looking at him with wide cornflower blue eyes, and she was crying, and she was smiling all at the same time. The second brother stepped forward and placed one hand on the older man's shoulder. The gesture was small, but its meaning was carved in stone. Where my brother stands, I stand. The youngest moved into the aisle, turned his back to the altar, and faced the congregation, one hand still resting easy on his revolver. His meaning was even clearer. Any man who wants to interfere with what is happening here will answer to me first. Harold Pemberton found his voice at last. "This is outrageous," he sputtered. "She has promised. There are debts, significant debts that—" "How much?" said the oldest brother, and he still did not turn around to look at the banker. He kept his eyes on Clara. "I beg your pardon. The debt, how much is it?" Pemberton hesitated. He looked around the congregation, saw faces he had controlled for years beginning to watch him with something new in their expressions. Curiosity, doubt. He smoothed his vest and answered in a voice he could not quite keep from shaking. $3,000. The oldest brother reached into the long coat he wore over his buckskin, and from an inside pocket he drew out a leather pouch. It was heavy. Even from a distance, Clara could see how it sagged in his hand. He turned at last, walked to the altar rail, and upended the pouch on the wooden top. Gold. Raw gold. Some of it still rough from the mountain streams of Elkhorn Ridge. Some of it cast into neat ingots by patient hands over 10 long winters. It caught the light from the stained glass and threw it back in every shade of fire. A collective gasp went up from the congregation. Children stood on their pews to see. Clara's hand rose to her mouth. It was more than $3,000. It was twice that at least. It was 10 years of a man's labor, his savings, his hopes, his future poured out on an altar for a woman he had never met. "I pay in full," the oldest brother said. "I take her to wife." Pemberton made a sound somewhere between a protest and a choke. But the crowd was no longer with him. The crowd had seen the gold. The crowd had seen the kiss. The crowd had seen a story it would tell for the rest of its natural life, and not one person in that church was going to be the one who broke it. Father Mackenzie stepped down from the pulpit with his hands shaking. He looked at Clara. He looked at the mountain man standing beside her. He asked the questions the ceremony required in a voice that had almost forgotten how. "Do you mistake this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Clara looked up into the steady gold eyes beside her. She was a Boston girl. She had never been brave in her life, but she had also never had a choice before. And here, for the first time since her father had died, she did have one. She could say no, and she did not truly know what would happen. She could say yes, and she did not truly know what would happen then either. But one of these unknowns had come down the aisle for her. One of them had put his gold on the altar and his promise in a kiss. "I do," she said, and her voice did not shake. "And do you, sir, take this woman?" "I do," the mountain man said before the question was finished. "By all that is holy, I do. What is your name, sir, for the record?" "Nathaniel Hawthorne of Elkhorn Ridge." The second brother stepped up to sign as witness. Elias Hawthorne. Then the youngest, Silas Hawthorne. The ink was still drying on the certificate when Nathaniel folded it carefully and slipped it into his inside pocket next to where the gold had been, as though he were exchanging one treasure for another. He offered his arm to Clara. She took it, and her fingers on his sleeve trembled only a little. They walked back down the center aisle together, the three brothers and the new bride, Elias at the rear, polite and watchful. Silas ahead, one hand on his revolver, daring anyone to speak. Harold Pemberton stood in the middle of the aisle with his face the color of old meat, and as they passed, Silas paused just long enough to lean in close. "Mr. Pemberton," the youngest Hawthorne said in a voice soft as a snake through grass, "you and I are going to have a conversation about this very soon. I look forward to it." Then he walked on. Behind them, the church doors closed on the congregation's shock. In front of them, 4 horses stood tied to the hitching post. One of them, a patient chestnut mare, wore a side saddle that Elias had stitched by lamplight through the previous night after Sarah Morrison had ridden up the mountain at sundown to tell them what was going to happen at the Cedar Falls church at 10 o'clock the next morning. "How did you know about me?" Clara asked as Nathaniel lifted her into the saddle. Her voice was a wondering whisper. Sarah Morrison, Nathaniel said. The girl they sold yesterday. Her grandfather was a friend of our father's before the bad years. She rode up the mountain last night through the dark crying and half frozen, and she told us what Pemberton was planning. We could not get down in time to save her, but there was still you. He swung up into his own saddle and looked down at her. We rode all night, ma'am, for a stranger. Clara, she said. My name is Clara. Clara, he repeated as if tasting it, as if trying to believe that a word so soft could belong to him now. They began the long ride up into the mountains. For the first hour, they rode in silence. Cedar Falls shrank behind them and the forest closed in. The air cooled. The light changed. Clara sat her air with careful hands and tried to understand that her life, the whole shape of it, had changed in the span of half a morning. She was married. She was a Hawthorne. The ring on her finger was a plain band Nathaniel had taken from his own pocket, and she did not yet know whose hand it had last been on, and she was not sure she was ready to know. Beside her, Nathaniel finally spoke. Are you afraid of me, Clara? She considered the question seriously. The trees rose dark and tall around them. The horse beneath her moved steady and sure. The man beside her was larger than any man she had ever seen, and the stories the townspeople had whispered about him as they rode out had been the stories told of beasts and killers. Should I be? She asked. Many people are. You rescued me, she said simply. I am not afraid. Something in his face shifted at that. A crack, she thought, though she could not yet read the lines of him well enough to be sure. He looked straight ahead down the trail for a long moment, and then so quietly she almost missed it, he said, Thank you. Elias, riding just behind, cleared his throat in a way that was clearly meant to cover a smile. Welcome to the Hawthorne family sister-in-law. He called, his voice warm as the summer sun. I am Elias. The one scowling at every shadow up ahead is Silas. He looks meaner than he is. A little meaner. Sometimes. Sister-in-law, Silas called back from the point without turning around. But Clara thought she heard the barest note of something gentle in his voice, something that was not meant for strangers. The words settled into her bones. Sister-in-law. They were not calling her a wife to be shared or a prize to be passed around. They were calling her family, brother's wife, a place in the house, a place at the table. She realized with a rush that made her eyes sting that she had not had a family to sit at a table with since the morning they had buried her father. They climbed for 3 hours, up switchbacks and through meadows where columbine grew in reckless blue drifts, across a clear creek so cold her horse tossed its head when it drank, through a stand of lodgepole pines so dense the light came down green as the bottom of the sea. And finally, just as the sun began to lean toward the western peaks, they crested a ridge and rode down into a hidden valley. Clara drew in her breath. She had expected a cabin, a rough thing perhaps, 4 walls and a roof. What she saw was a house. It was 2 stories tall, built of peeled logs fitted so tight you could not have slipped a knife blade between them. A wide covered porch wrapped around 2 sides. Real glass windows caught the golden afternoon light and threw it back in bright squares. A stone chimney rose from the roof and lazy smoke curled upward from it. Nearby stood a proper horse barn, a woodshed stacked to the eaves, a smokehouse, a vegetable garden laid out in careful rows, and a small creek that ran right past the kitchen door and disappeared among the trees. You built this, she said. We built it, Nathaniel said. 10 years of winters. I drew the plans. Elias is the carpenter of the family. Silas hauled the logs. Our father taught us what he could before he died. The rest we figured it out as we went. It is beautiful, she said, and she meant it in a way that surprised her. It was not beautiful the way a Boston parlor was beautiful. It was beautiful the way a psalm was beautiful, made by human hands in hard country with love. Elias dismounted first and held the mare's head, while Nathaniel lifted Clara down. His hands spanned her waist easily. He set her on her feet as though she weighed nothing, and for just a moment her hands rested on his arms, and she felt the steady strength of him beneath his sleeve. Then he stepped back. Polite, careful, a man of honor. Inside the house was warmer than she had dared hope. The main room was dominated by a great stone fireplace already laid for the evening. There was a long trestle table of oiled pine hand-carved chairs, shelves filled with books, real books. A worn Bible lay on the mantel. A set of pewter mugs hung from pegs. The floors were wide planks sanded smooth and polished by years of boots. Nathaniel led her to a door at the back and opened it. "This is your room," he said, and he did not look at her as he said it. He looked at the floor, at the window, anywhere but her face. "We fixed it up 3 years ago. Our mother, before she passed, she used to say that one day a good woman might need a pretty place." Elias took her at her word. Clara stepped inside and her hand went to her mouth. A white iron bed stood against one wall covered with a quilt in a wedding ring pattern, the most intricate needlework she had ever seen. Lace curtains at the window clearly sewn by men who had been doing their best to remember what their mother had once made. A dressing table with a mirror. A hooked rug on the floor. A carved cedar wardrobe standing open and entirely empty waiting. And in the corner under a linen cloth cover something that made her heart stop. She crossed the room slowly. She lifted the cloth. A piano. A small, upright old, but cared for its rosewood worn smooth where fingers had once rested. A hymnal lay on top. A jar of wildflowers sat beside it. "A piano," she whispered. Elias was in the doorway, red to the roots of his chestnut hair. "I bought it off a homesteader 2 years back. His wagon had broken axle and he could not haul it any further. I do not know how to play. None of us do not, since Lily. I just thought, someday, maybe." Clara sat down on the bench without thinking. She laid her hands on the keys. The ivory was yellowed with age, but the action was still good. She pressed a chord soft as a question. It answered her in tune. She began to play, without deciding, without meaning to. Her fingers found the opening bars of Schubert's Ave Maria because it was the piece her mother had played when she was a small child, because it was the piece her father had asked her to play on the last Sunday of his life, because it was what came to her hands in a moment too large for words. The house went quiet. She played the first verse. She played the second. And when she came to the final phrase, her voice unsteady but true rose up to meet the melody. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum. When the last note faded, she did not turn around for a long time. She was afraid of what she would see. When she did turn, finally she saw all three of them in the doorway. Silas, the youngest, the fierce one, the one whose hand had rested all day on his revolver, was standing with his face turned slightly away, and he was wiping his eyes with the heel of his hand as though he were angry with the tears for coming. Elias was smiling, and his eyes shone wet. And Nathaniel stood in the center, his gaze fixed on her, and he was not hiding anything at all. His jaw was working, his hands were fists at his sides. He looked like a man who had opened a door he thought had been sealed forever and walked straight into a room full of light. "Our sister," he said when he could speak. "Lily. She played that same piece. She played it on the night they came. She was at the keyboard when the Kellermans broke down the door." Clara rose from the bench. She did not know these men. She had known them for 6 hours. But she crossed the room to Nathaniel and she put her arms around his waist and she laid her cheek against his chest. He stood frozen for the space of a breath as though he could not quite believe it, and then his arms came around her, slow and careful, as if she were made of something that could shatter. Elias stepped forward and laid a hand on his brother's shoulder. Silas, still fighting his eyes, crossed the room and did the same. The four of them stood that way in the doorway of a room that had been waiting 3 years to be filled, while outside the high country sun slid behind the western peaks and the first stars came out over Elkhorn Ridge. That night after supper, after Clara had gone to her room and closed the door, and for the first time in half a year cried herself to sleep in something that felt like peace, the three brothers sat together before the fire. For a long time no one spoke. The flames worked in the hearth. Somewhere out in the dark, an owl called. "Does she know?" Silas said at last. About Pemberton, about what he really is. Not yet, Nathaniel said. She should know. She should, but not tonight. Give her one night, Silas. One night of believing she is safe. Elias leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. He is not going to let this stand, he said quietly. Pemberton, that much gold on the altar in front of the whole town. That kiss. She was supposed to be his. He will come. I know, said Nathaniel. How long do we have? Nathaniel stared into the fire and his eyes were very far away. He was seeing his father's burned barn. He was seeing his mother's wedding ring on a hand that no longer had any heat in it. He was seeing his sister Lily, 16 years old, at the keyboard of the piano in the parlor where the parlor no longer stood. He was seeing a boy 14 years old slipping out a back window with blood on his shirt and hatred in his eyes. A boy they had all assumed was dead, a boy whose name had been Walter Kellerman. A month, he said finally, maybe less. The fire burned down, the owl called again, and on Elkhorn Ridge a new story was beginning, and none of the four people under that roof yet knew how far they would have to travel before it ended. But Clara Hawthorne slept, and for the first time in a long time, she did not dream of being alone. The first light of morning came through the tall pines and long gold bars, and when Clara opened her eyes, she did not at first remember where she was. The bed beneath her was soft. The quilt was heavy and warm. Somewhere outside the window, an axe was biting steady into wood, and the sound carried on the cold, clean air like a heartbeat. She sat up slowly. Her hair had come loose in the night and spilled honey gold across her shoulders. The silver cross at her throat caught the morning light. For a long moment, she simply sat looking at the small, pretty room these three large men had built 3 years ago, waiting as she now understood for someone they had not yet met. For her. The axe stopped. Boots crossed the porch. Then Elias Hawthorne's voice called softly through the door. Careful not to startle. Miss Clara, there is coffee on the stove whenever you are ready. No hurry at all. She smiled without meaning to. Miss Clara, not Mrs., not yet. He was giving her time. She dressed in the only gown she had, the traveling dress she had worn up the mountain, and she brushed her hair out with the silver-back brush from her mother's vanity, and she pressed her hand once against her cross, and she went out to meet her new life. The main room was warm with the fire already built up. A blue speckled coffee pot sat on the stove, and the smell of it filled the whole house. Elias was at the kitchen end of the long trestle table, frowning in concentration at a pan of biscuits that had come out a shade too brown. He looked up when she appeared, and the smile that crossed his face was so bright and uncomplicated that it startled her. Good morning, sister-in-law, he said. I apologize in advance for the biscuits. My mother would have had words with me about these. They look wonderful, Clara said. You are either very polite or very hungry. Either way, please sit. Silas came in from the porch with an armload of split kindling, his golden hair damp from the cold mountain water he had clearly washed in. He nodded to her the way a man tips his hat, wordless but respectful, and he disappeared toward the fireplace without a word. Through the window, Clara could see Nathaniel out at the horse barn, his back to the house, throwing hay for the mare she had ridden yesterday. She watched him for a moment, that broad back, those careful hands, and she felt something quiet and steady settle into her chest. He was her husband. The word was still new. It still felt like a garment cut too large for her frame, but it fit a little better this morning than it had last night. They ate together at the long table. Elias kept up a gentle flow of talk, pointing out which windows caught the best light for reading in the afternoons, explaining how the creek sometimes iced over in January, and they had to chop through it for water, telling a story about the first winter in the house, when Silas had caught a fox in the hen house, and the rooster had never forgiven any of them. Silas himself spoke only when spoken to, but Clara noticed that every time her coffee cup was half empty, the speckled pot appeared in his hand to refill it without a word, and then vanished again. Nathaniel came in last. He took off his hat and hung it on the peg by the door the way a man coming home from the fields has done for 10,000 years. He washed his hands at the basin. He took his seat at the head of the table, and before he picked up his spoon, He folded his hands, and he said the grace his mother had taught him, thanking God for the food, and for the hands that had raised it, and for the new blessing that sat at his table now. When he said amen, he looked up and his eyes met Clara's, and she understood that she had just been named in a prayer for the first time in a very long time. She did not trust her voice. She simply nodded. And so the days began to pass. The first week was a careful dance. Three men who had lived alone on a mountain for 10 long years were learning slowly and clumsily how to share a house with a young woman. Elias knocked over his coffee cup twice in one morning because Clara had come into the kitchen with her hair loose. Silas, hard as boot leather in every other circumstance, could not seem to look her in the eye for 3 full days, and only ever addressed her from over his shoulder. Nathaniel himself dropped an axe on his own foot the afternoon Clara passed him carrying a basket of laundry, and he did not even flinch. Clara pretended she had not seen, and later when she was alone in her room, she laughed until tears ran down her cheeks. They began without discussion to divide the teaching of her. Elias took on the kitchen. He showed her the iron stove, the proper way to bank coals, how to render bacon fat so nothing was wasted, how their mother had made sourdough starter that was still alive 20 years later in a crock in the pantry. He was a patient teacher with hands more delicate than any of his brothers, hands that could fit a dovetail joint so tight you could not find the seam. He laughed at her mistakes in a way that made her laugh too. He burned the next batch of biscuits even worse than the first just to make her feel better. Silas took on the outdoors. He taught her to saddle her own mare. He put a light rifle into her hands and walked her out to the meadow beyond the woodshed and stood behind her, correcting her stance, her grip the angle of her elbow. She was a terrible shot at first. She shook too much. She closed her eyes when the hammer dropped. But Silas did not laugh, and Silas did not tease, and slowly, by the end of the week, she could put a bullet into a tin can at 20 paces. The first time she did it, she turned to him with her whole face lit up, and for a single instant, she saw the smile he had been hiding since his sister Lily died. It was a boy smile. It surprised him into showing it, and it vanished again as soon as he realized it was there. But Clara had seen it, and she tucked it away in her heart and did not speak of it. Nathaniel took on the soul of the house. Every evening after supper was cleared and the lamps were lit, he sat with her by the stone fireplace and he talked. He was not a talking man by nature. 10 years on a mountain had made him a quiet man, a watching man. But with Clara, slowly he began to open. He told her about his father, Jonathan Hawthorne, who had come from County Kerry in Ireland in 1850 with nothing but a blacksmith's apron and a prayer book. He told her about his mother, Mercy Hawthorne, a nurse in Boston who had read an advertisement in a church bulletin for a bride to travel west and had taken the train alone at 21 years old to marry a man she had corresponded with for 6 months. Clara's hand tightened around her coffee cup at that. "Your mother was a mail-order bride," she said. Nathaniel looked at her with something like wonder in his face, as though the connection had never occurred to him before. "She was," he said quietly. "By God, she was." He told her about Lily. He spoke of his sister slowly in pieces, as though the memory of her was a delicate thing that had to be handled gently. Lily had been the baby of the family. She had been born when Mercy was already in her 40s, a surprise, a late sweetness. She had loved yellow wildflowers and small creatures and the piano. She had been 16 years old when she died. She had wanted to be a teacher. She was playing Ave Maria, Nathaniel said, and his voice was very steady, in the way a man's voice is steady when he is holding back something enormous. That night, when they came, she was at the piano in the parlor. I was out in the timber. Elias was down by the creek with a knife wound in his side that one of them had given him half an hour earlier. Silas was only 17 years old, and he had his grandfather's old Sharps rifle, and he was running toward the house in the dark. We got there, Clara. We killed every last man who had come onto our land, but we were 20 minutes too late for our mother, and we were 10 minutes too late for our father, and we were 3 minutes too late for Lily. She did not say anything. She only reached across the small space between their chairs and laid her hand over his. He let her. He did not look at her. He looked into the fire. A woman I was going to marry left me a week after that, he said. Her name was Miriam. She said I had blood on my hands. She said she could not sleep next to a man with blood on his hands. So she went, and I could not blame her, Clara. I have never blamed her. Clara spoke without thinking. The words came up out of her in a rush. She was wrong. He turned his head at last. His eyes found her. A man who protects his family does not have blood on his hands, Clara Bond said, and her voice was not quite steady, but it was sure. He has a weight on his shoulders. That is a different thing, a very different thing. I do not know your Miriam Nathaniel Hawthorne, but she did not understand that difference, and it was her loss, not yours. He looked at her for so long she began to be afraid. And then very slowly he lifted her hand from where it rested on his, and he turned it over, and he pressed his lips to the center of her palm. It was not a passionate kiss. It was something older and more solemn than that. It was the kiss a knight gives to the hand of his lady. It was a promise and a gratitude, in a small, careful opening of a door that had been nailed shut for 10 long years. Clara, he said, I think I am beginning to love you. She could not speak for a moment. Her throat had closed. When she did speak, it was only a whisper. I think I am beginning to love you too. He kissed her forehead, only her forehead. And then he sat back and he watched the fire burn, and she sat beside him, her hand still warm where his lips had touched it, and she understood that she was being courted by a man of honor, by her own husband, and that this was perhaps the most beautiful thing she had ever been given. On the 10th day, everything changed. Clara was cleaning out the woodshed, a task none of the brothers had gotten around to in at least a year. She had decided it would be her first gift to the house. She was moving an old wooden crate when she saw that one of the boards at the back of the shed was newer than the others. Fresher wood, not weathered in. She pried it loose with a hand axe. Behind the board, tucked into the gap between the shed wall and the insulation of old rags and paper, was a leather-bound Bible, not an old one, no more than a year or two in that hiding place. She took it out. She opened it. A folded piece of paper fell from between the pages of Psalms into her lap. Her hands began to shake as she read. If anyone is reading this, Reverend J.W. and his daughter are in danger. Pemberton has a list. The Hawthornes are the only men I trust. Proof is in the hollow of the old oak behind the woodshed. J.M., Jacob Morrison, the night clerk at the Cedar Falls Bank, Sarah Morrison's grandfather, the old man who had died 6 months ago of a heart attack that had seemed sudden and strange to everyone in town, though no one had dared say so aloud. Reverend J.W., Reverend Josiah Whitmore, her father. Clara sat down hard on a pile of split logs, and the world seemed to tilt underneath her. Her father had not died of a heart. Her father had died because he had known something, and Jacob Morrison had known it too, and Jacob Morrison had died of the same sudden heart as her father. And Harold Pemberton had a list, and she was on that list. She was on her feet again before she had finished the thought. She was running. She was calling for her husband. Nathaniel came at a dead run from the barn. Elias from the porch. Silas appeared from nowhere, his revolver already in his hand. They found her in the yard with the letter clutched against her chest, and she could not speak for a full minute. She handed Nathaniel the paper. His face as he read went through a series of changes Clara did not know a face could make. First confusion, then recognition, then a darkness so complete it was like a lamp going out behind his eyes. Silas, he said, the oak, now. Silas ran. Elias read the letter over Nathaniel's shoulder, and his chestnut hair fell forward and his hands tightened into fists. My God, he said softly. My God. Silas came back 5 minutes later carrying a flat metal box the size of a Bible, black with dirt and the damp of the earth. He set it down on the porch. He took a knife and he pried off the rusted lid. Inside lay a stack of papers thick as a man's thumb. Account ledgers, ledger pages cut from the Cedar Falls bank books showing transfers that should never have occurred. Copies of fraudulent loan documents signed with names of men and women who are now dead. Letters, many letters, all in a careful copperplate hand that was not Pemberton's. Letters between Pemberton and a man who signed himself only with the initials W.K. And beneath it all, a hand-drawn map of the territory with 3 large areas circled in red ink. The largest of the 3 circles took in the whole of Elkhorn Ridge. Elias, who read faster than any of them, had the papers spread out on the porch boards in a kind of fury within the hour. His chestnut hair was in his eyes. His hands were ink-stained from where he had smeared a wet page. His voice was not quite under control. "This is not Pemberton alone," he said. "Pemberton is a piece. A significant piece, but a piece. There is a network out of Chicago, money, real money, moving into Montana territory, buying up notes, buying up sheriffs, buying up judges, forging debts on good men, killing the ones who cannot be bought." He jabbed a finger at the map. "And the prize, the single largest holding they have tried to acquire in 2 years of operation, is our land." "WK," Silas said flatly. "Who is WK?" Nathaniel already knew. Clara could see it in his face. The knowledge sat in him like something he had been swallowing down for 10 years and could no longer keep below the surface. "Walter Kellerman," he said. "The boy. The 14-year-old Kellerman boy. The one we assumed was dead. He is alive," Elias said, reading from a letter dated 2 years earlier. "He is alive, and he is operating out of Chicago, and he has been building this network since he was 18 years old. Building it for one purpose: come back, take the land, finish his family's work, finish us." Clara found her voice at last. "And my father." The 3 brothers turned to look at her. She was holding the silver cross at her throat so hard the chain was pressing a red line into her neck. "My father," she said again. "Why did they kill my father?" Elias had been reading as she spoke. He looked up now with an expression she would never forget for the rest of her life. "Your father did volunteer bookkeeping at the Cedar Falls Bank when he was alive," he said gently. "Twice a year, for a decade. I have a letter here. It is addressed to a Mr. Cornelius Bennett, attorney at law of Chicago." Clara's breath caught. "My uncle." "Your father wrote to your Uncle Cornelius 3 weeks before he died. He told him he had found irregularities in the Pemberton books, transfers he could not account for, debts that were appearing on the ledgers with no supporting documentation. He asked your uncle as an attorney what he ought to do. He said he was afraid." Elias's voice was very soft now. "Pemberton intercepted the letter, Clara, or he got wind of the inquiry some other way. We do not yet know. But within 3 weeks of your father writing that letter, your father was dead. And within 2 months of your father's death, an advertisement appeared in a Boston newspaper for a mail-order bride. And within 6 months of your father's death, you were standing at an altar in Cedar Falls, wearing a borrowed dress and wondering how your life had gone so wrong so fast. You were not bait, Clara. You were the hook." She sat down on the porch boards. She did not remember choosing to sit down. Her legs simply stopped holding her. Nathaniel went down on one knee in front of her. He took both her hands in his, and his hands were so large they swallowed hers completely. And they were shaking, not from fear, but from the barely controlled fury of a man who had just learned that his wife had been stolen from her own father's grave. "Clara," he said, "look at me. Look at my face." She looked. "We are going to make him answer for this. Your father, Jacob Morrison, Lily, my mother, my father, all of them. I swear it to you on the graves of my parents and on the soul of my sister. Harold Pemberton and Walter Kellerman and every man who served them are going to answer. Do you hear me, Clara Hawthorne? Do you hear me?" She nodded. She could not speak. Silas was standing behind his brother. He stepped forward, and he did something Clara had not seen him do in the 10 days she had known him. He crouched down and he put one rough hand over hers and his brother's, covering them both. Sister, he said, and his voice was the voice of the boy who had once smiled when he had taught her to shoot a tin can. You are not alone in this, not for another hour of your life. Elias laid his hand on top of Silas's. Not one more hour. They came 3 nights later. Clara would remember it afterward the way one remembers a dream. The four of them had been at the long table lamps, lit the papers from the metal box spread between them, planning their ride down to Cedar Falls to find Judge Harrison of the Federal Circuit, who Elias had read was due in the territory that very week. She was pouring coffee for Silas when the first bullet came through the kitchen window. Glass exploded onto the pine boards. The bullet buried itself in the beam above the fireplace. Clara screamed. Silas was already moving, had already thrown her to the floor, was already covering her body with his own, as a second and a third shot came through the window. 6 men! Nathaniel barked from somewhere low and on the other side of the table. West side, tree line. 8, Elias called back. 2 more just broke cover east. The lamps went out. Silas's hand pressed her down into the floorboards. Stay here, he whispered against her hair. Sister, stay down. Do not move. Not for anything. And then the Hawthorne brothers did what the Hawthorne brothers had been built to do. Clara could see almost nothing from where she lay. She could only hear. 3 rifles working in a rhythm she did not know rifles could work in. Nathaniel at the west window, Elias at the east. Silas moving, always moving from one position to another, his revolver barking out its shorter, harder answer to the longer cracks of the Winchesters. The men outside shouted to one another. Someone out there screamed and did not scream again. Glass shattered in another part of the house. A man tried to rush the porch, and a single shot from Nathaniel's rifle dropped him on the first step. It lasted 20 minutes, though it felt to Clara like hours. Then slowly the shots from outside became ragged, uncertain. Then she heard the sound of men breaking and running for their horses. Then she heard only the wind and the wounded breathing of someone very close to her. Elias had taken a bullet in the shoulder. It was not a killing wound. It had passed through the meat above his collarbone and out his back clean, but it was bleeding badly. Clara's hands were steady as she tore strips from her own petticoat, because Silas had told her during their shooting lessons that the steady hands come to those who have already decided to have them. She boiled water. She cleaned the wound. She held the cloth in place while Nathaniel stitched his brother with a needle Elias had carved himself from elk bone, and the whole time Elias grinned through his teeth and told bad jokes. Sister, he said at one point, sweat on his forehead, you will forgive me if I say you are holding up considerably better than I am. I am not, Clara said softly, but I am trying. That, Elias said, is all any of us ever do when the time comes. The rest of that night, Nathaniel sat beside Clara in her small, pretty room. He did not touch her. He did not speak much. He sat in a chair by her bed with his rifle across his knees, and when she could not close her eyes without seeing the flash of muzzle fire, he began very quietly to sing. It was a lullaby in a language she did not know. Irish, his mother's tongue. A song Mercy Hawthorne had once sung to a baby who had later grown up to become this enormous, careful man. Clara fell asleep to it. In the morning when she woke, he was still there, and his rifle was still across his knees, and his eyes were red-rimmed and steady, and she understood without being told that he had not slept at all. 3 weeks passed. Elias healed, though the shoulder remained stiff. He could still draw a bead with a long rifle from a rest, but a pistol in a close room was no longer a weapon he could trust, and all 3 brothers knew it, though no one said it aloud. The window was boarded over with fresh timber. Silas split from a fallen lodgepole. The bodies of the 4 men who had died in the yard were buried without ceremony beyond the far fence. Nathaniel rode the perimeter of the property twice a day. Silas slept in the main room, now on a pallet by the door, his revolver within arm's reach. The fear was a new resident in the house, but it did not rule the house. What ruled the house, strangely, was something closer to love. They ate together. They prayed together. Elias carved a small wooden cross in the evenings by lamplight, and when it was finished, he gave it to Clara and she hung it on the wall above her bed next to the ones her mother had once hung above hers. On the 22nd day after the attack, Sarah Morrison rode up the mountain. She came in alone on a tired bay, her hair full of twigs and her dress torn at the hem. She was 16 years old and her eyes were older than her grandmother's had been. Clara ran out to meet her and all but carried her inside and sat her by the fire and put coffee in her hands, and Sarah drank it in 4 long swallows and set the cup down and began to speak. "Pemberton is dead," she said. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. "Walter Kellerman killed him," Sarah said. "2 nights ago in the office above the bank. Shot him in the head and left him for the clerk to find in the morning. He is saying publicly that he found Pemberton that way. He is saying Pemberton had enemies. He is saying he is here as Pemberton's Chicago associate to restore order to the bank and to the town. He has 20 men with him, ma'am, all of them Chicago guns. He has put a bounty of $1,000 on the head of each Hawthorne brother." Silas laughed once short and hard like a man appreciating the quality of an insult. "Only 1,000, Walter. I am disappointed." "And there is a standing offer," Sarah said, and her voice went small, of $500 for the return of Mrs. Hawthorne, alive. The room went very still. "There is more," Sarah said. "Judge Ezekiel Harrison of the Federal Circuit arrived in Cedar Falls 4 days ago. They have him confined to the Grand Hotel, watched day and night, but he is alive. And ma'am." She turned to Clara, and her eyes were shining with something that might have been the first tears she had allowed herself in a week. "Your uncle, Mr. Cornelius Bennett. He arrived in Cedar Falls 3 days ago. He asked after you at the boarding house. He asked after the Hawthorns. And this morning the word in town was that he had never come in for breakfast. His room was empty. His bag was gone. They took him, Mrs. Hawthorne. Walter Kellerman's men took your uncle." Clara had to sit down. "He came," she whispered. "He came all the way from Chicago for me." "He came for you," Sarah agreed, "and for your father, and they have him now." That night there was a council at the long table, all 4 of them. "We ride," Silas said. "Tonight we ride down before sunrise and we find him." "We do not know where they are holding him," Elias countered. "We do not know if he is still in the town or if they have moved him out. We need a plan." "Elias is right," Nathaniel said. "We ride at first light, not tonight. In daylight on our terms with the evidence. We get to Judge Harrison. We make it public. We take Cedar Falls by sunset tomorrow, one way or another." "You 3 ride," Silas said. "I will stay with Clara." "No," Nathaniel said. "No," Elias said. "No," Clara said, and all 3 of them turned to look at her. She stood up from her chair. Her hands were flat on the long table. Her honey gold hair had slipped from its pins and fell around her soft cheeks, and her eyes were the clear, pale blue of a high, cold morning. "I am going with you," she said. "Clara," Nathaniel said. "I am going with you," she said again. "My father is dead. My uncle is taken. If there is one Whitmore left in the world to stand for our name, it is me. I am a Hawthorne now by your grace and by my own choosing. And a Hawthorne wife does not sit on the mountain while her husband rides to war. Not mine, not yours. Do not ask me to Nathaniel. Do not ask it." For a long moment her husband did not answer. Then he rose. He walked around the long table to where she stood. He took her face in his hands as he had done in the church on the day he had kissed her in front of the whole town, and he looked at her as if he were memorizing her. "Clara Hawthorne," he said, "you are the strongest woman God ever sent into the state of Montana." Elias laughed wet-eyed. "Welcome to the full Hawthorne Company, sister." Silas nodded once, and there was no argument left in him. They rode out the next mornings before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. Clara wore a split riding skirt Elias had sewn for her through 2 long nights, practical and modest and beautifully finished at the seams. She carried a small pistol at her hip tucked into a leather holster for her own protection, only because Nathaniel had told her very quietly the night before that he would do the fighting. She had not argued. Some battles were his. On her finger was a plain gold band. Around her neck was her mother's cross. In her saddlebag were her share of the documents from the metal box wrapped in oil cloth against the weather, because Nathaniel had insisted that each of them carry a portion so that if they were separated, any one of them could bring down Walter Kellerman alone. That last evening on the mountain that she had stood on the porch and looked down over the dark valley below them, Nathaniel had come out and stood beside her without speaking. After a while, he had taken her hand. "Clara," he had said, "whatever happens tomorrow, you should know. I did not marry you to save you from Pemberton. I married you because the moment I walked into that church and I saw you standing there with your chin up and your hands shaking, I knew you were the woman I had been waiting for. I had just not known until that moment that I had been waiting. Do you understand me?" "I understand you," she had whispered. "I love you. I love you, Nathaniel Hawthorne." He had leaned down and he had kissed her, and this time it was not the kiss of the altar. This time it was the kiss of a husband to his wife, a man to his woman, a vow already made and now renewed under a sky full of mountain stars. Behind them through the window, Clara had been able to see Elias and Silas by the fire pretending very hard to be absorbed in their coffee, and the sight had made her laugh against her husband's mouth. And he had laughed too, and for one moment the whole weight of what was coming had lifted. Now they rode, 4 horses on a narrow trail, the morning air cold enough to show their breath. Clara in the center, Silas at the point, Elias at the rear, Nathaniel at her side. Below them at the foot of the mountain, a thin column of torchlight had been burning in the streets of Cedar Falls all the night long. Walter Kellerman was waiting. He did not yet know they were coming, but he was waiting all the same. Nathaniel reached across the distance between their horses and took his wife's hand. "Ready, Mrs. Hawthorne?" "Ready, Mr. Hawthorne." They started down. They came down out of the high country in the cold blue hour before the sun touched the valley floor. 4 horses on a narrow ridge trail, their breath fogging out in long white plumes. Silas rode point, his pale eyes working the timber on both sides, reading the ground, the way another man might read a page of scripture. Elias rode rear, turning in his saddle every few minutes to check the trail behind them. Nathaniel rode beside Clara in the center, and twice without speaking, he reached across and touched her gloved hand, and twice she closed her fingers around his for a moment before letting go. They were perhaps 2 hours from the foot of the mountain when Silas raised his hand. He did not speak. He did not need to. All 4 horses stopped as though they had been one animal with one mind, and the silence of the morning closed in around them. Silas swung down from his saddle without a sound and pointed down into the brush below the trail. Clara saw him before her mind could understand what she was seeing. A man's body face down, half hidden in the willows along a small mountain stream. His coat was a fine black wool coat of the sort a Chicago lawyer would wear. His hands were bound behind him with rope. His hair, once gray, was matted dark with old blood. She was off her horse before anyone could stop her. "Uncle Cornelius!" she cried, and she was slipping down the bank on her palms and her heels, her riding skirt tearing on a branch. "Uncle Cornelius." Nathaniel caught up to her in 3 long strides and took her shoulders and held her back. "Wait, Clara. Wait for Silas." Silas was already down in the brush. He knelt. He put 2 fingers against the side of the old man's throat. For a long, terrible moment, his face did not move. Then his eyes came up, and they were bright. "He is alive." Clara made a sound that was almost a sum, and Nathaniel let her go, and together they scrambled the rest of the way down to where the old man lay. Cornelius Bennett was 58 years old, and he had been a man of the libraries and courtrooms of Chicago all his life, and Walter Kellerman's men had worked on him for 3 full days. There were burns on the backs of his hands. 2 of his fingers were broken. One of his eyes was swollen shut, and the side of his face was a single dark bruise. His breathing, when Clara knelt beside him and lifted his head gently into her lap, came in shallow, careful sips, as though every breath had a price. "Uncle," she whispered. "Uncle Cornelius, it is Clara. It is little Clara. Please, please." His one good eye fluttered open. It wandered unfocused, and then it found her face. For a long second, he did not seem to understand what he was looking at. Then his cracked lips moved and his voice came out as a threat of a thing. Josiah's girl, he whispered. God above. Josiah's girl. I am here, Uncle. I am right here. Elias was beside them now, with his canteen, and he was already tearing strips from a clean linen shirt he had brought in his saddlebag for exactly this kind of moment. He washed the old man's face. He gave him water in small sips. He spoke to him the way a man speaks to a frightened horse, low and steady, nothing hurried. Sir, Elias said. Mr. Bennett, sir, can you tell me where they were holding you? Can you tell me how you came to be out here? The wary old lawyer coughed and his whole body shuddered. They did not think I would reach Chicago, he rasped. They took me out of the hall the first night, kept me in a root cellar beneath a stable at the east end of town, questioned me, wanted names, allies, every man I had briefed on the Kellerman operation. I gave them nothing. This morning before dawn, Walter himself came down and said he was done with me. They threw me in a wagon and they carried me up out of town and they dumped me here to die. They thought I was already dying. I very nearly was. You are not dying today, Elias said firmly. You must listen to me. Girl, listen. Clara leaned close. Her ear was almost against her uncle's mouth. I am not alone, he whispered. Before I left Chicago, I wired the office of the United States Marshal for the Montana Territory. Captain Theodore Brooks, old friend, fought with him in the war. They are coming, Clara, a full detachment. They are coming by rail to Miles City and then by horse up the valley. 2 days, I told him, 48 hours. They will be in Cedar Falls by tomorrow night. If you can hold out, if you can keep the evidence alive, if you can keep yourself alive. Nathaniel's jaw was set as hard as stone. He looked at his brothers over Clara's shoulder. A day and a half, he said. That is what we have. A day and a half to survive Cedar Falls. Silas spat into the dirt. We have survived 10 years on less. The decision came quickly as it had to. Elias made the call before Nathaniel could. Brother, my shoulder is still stiff. My pistol hand is slow. I'm no use to you in a close fight inside that hotel. I stay with the old man. I get him to the abandoned Morrison cabin on the edge of town. Sarah knows the way. She and I will hold him there until the marshals arrive. If you need me for long work, I can still set up a rifle from cover. But the close indoor fighting that will have to be Silas's job and yours. Silas opened his mouth to argue, and then he looked at Elias's face, and then he looked at the old lawyer cradled in Clara's lap, and he shut his mouth again. Agreed, Nathaniel said. Clara hugged Elias before she remounted her horse. She did not cry. She held onto her brother-in-law for one long moment, and then she stepped back. You keep safe, Elias, she said. Sister, he answered, you keep my brothers safe. They are rough men. They need a gentle hand sometimes. You be that hand. She nodded, unable to speak. He smiled his warm chestnut smile at her one last time, and then he and Silas and Nathaniel lifted the old lawyer up onto the back of Elias's horse, and Elias mounted behind him to hold him in the saddle, and he turned off the main trail onto a narrower game path that wound down toward the Morrison cabin below. 3 horses rode on toward Cedar Falls. They reached the outskirts of the town as the evening light was beginning to thin. Clara almost did not recognize Cedar Falls. Walter Kellerman had turned it into a walled camp. There were armed men on the rooftops. There were armed men at the ends of the main street. The saloon windows had been boarded shut. A strange flag flew from the pole above the mayor's office, as though Walter had already decided that Montana was a province of his own little empire. They left the horses tied in a grove of cottonwoods behind the cooper's shop. They went in on foot through alleys and back lots, Elias ahead, moving the way he had moved across 10 years of wilderness, Clara between them in a long dark shawl that hid her bright hair, Nathaniel at the rear with his hand on the butt of his revolver. Mrs. Patterson, the widow who cooked at the Grand Hotel, met them at the kitchen door. She had been waiting for them since 2 o'clock that afternoon when Sarah Morrison had slipped her a note. She was in her 60s and she had lost a son to Pemberton's foreclosures 2 winters before. She did not speak as she let them in. She only gripped Clara's hand for a moment hard, and she nodded toward the back stairs. "Third floor," she whispered. "Room 7. The judge has been there alone this hour past. The two men watching his door went down to the bar for supper 15 minutes ago. You have maybe 10 minutes, maybe less. God go with you." They climbed the back stairs on the balls of their feet. Judge Ezekiel Harrison opened the door to Clara's soft knock and immediately stepped aside to let her in. He was a thin, tall man of 60, silver-haired, and his face when he saw Clara was the face of a man who had been praying without knowing he was praying. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said. "Dear God, Mrs. Hawthorne, is it you? It is your honor, and I bring you what you need." She emptied her saddlebag onto his writing desk. Nathaniel emptied his. Silas at the door with his revolver drawn watched the hallway. Judge Harrison began to read. Clara had seen her husband read those papers. She had seen Elias read them. She had never seen a man read them like Judge Harrison read them. He read them the way a man who has been thirsty for a very long time drinks from a clean, cold well. His hands began to shake. His breath began to come in short bursts. At the end of 10 minutes, he looked up at Clara, and there were tears on his face because he had been a federal judge in this territory for 18 years, and he had known something was wrong in Cedar Falls for most of those years, and he had never until now been given the proof he needed to act. "This is enough," he said softly. "Mrs. Hawthorne, this is enough to hang 20 men. This is enough to unravel a criminal conspiracy that reaches into 3 states. Do you understand what you have brought me?" "I understand, Your Honor. You and your husband and your brothers-in-law are going to change this territory." It was at that moment that they heard the boots on the stairs. Not the boots of 2 guards coming back from supper. Many boots, running. Silas had the door shut and bolted before the first boot hit the landing. He turned and his face was the face Clara had seen only once before the night the Chicago men had come up the mountain. It was not the face of a young man. It was the face of something very old that lived inside a young man and only came out when the killing was close. "Clara," Silas said in a voice that was calm as a still pond. "The window now." She ran to it. 3 stories down there was a wooden delivery yard behind the hotel, and a small figure was waiting there, a boy. 12 years old, maybe. Billy Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's grandson, the one Clara had given $4 to that afternoon. She threw up the message. She hurled the oilcloth bundle containing the full second set of the evidence papers down into the yard. The boy caught it clean against his chest and ran. Ran like a deer for the alley that led out toward the Morrison cabin, ran with the proof that was going to reach Elias and Cornelius Bennett and the oncoming marshals, no matter what happened inside room 7 of the Grand Hotel. "The evidence is safe," she said, turning, and her voice did not even shake. "Whatever happens in this room now, the evidence is safe." The door splintered inward. Walter Kellerman stepped through it. He was 24 years old. He was slight, almost delicate, with a narrow, handsome face and very pale gray eyes, the kind of face that looked as though it had never done a day's physical work. He wore a beautifully tailored Chicago suit. 6 armed men crowded in behind him, rifles and revolvers leveled. He looked at the Hawthorne brothers, and a smile spread slowly across his face, the smile of a boy who had been waiting 10 years for a particular birthday. 10 years, he said, and his voice was soft and pleased. 10 years I have been imagining this moment. Gentlemen, please drop your weapons. Nathaniel did not move. "Walter," he said, "you were a child. I was 14. You were a child. We did not hunt you. We let you go. You slaughtered my father and my uncles and my grown cousins on the front lawn of my own home, while I ran for my life out the back, while I hid in a ditch for 3 days without water, while I walked 80 miles to a cousin in Wyoming who did not want me. You made me Nathaniel Hawthorne. You and your brothers made me, and now I have come back to unmake you." His gray eyes slid to Clara, and his smile widened. "And you, Mrs. Hawthorne, Mrs. Mail Order Bride, I was going to let Pemberton have you. I was very patient. I was going to let the old fool think he had won. But Pemberton lost his nerve at the end. He was going to warn your uncle off. I could not allow that. So I had to kill him and take over the Cedar Falls operation personally. And here we all are, together, at the end of my story and the end of yours. He raised his pistol. He pointed it at Clara's face. Three things happened in the same second. The first thing was Silas. He had been positioned, Clara realized afterward, since the moment the door had begun to splinter. He did not draw his revolver from a hip holster the way most men drew. He had pulled it the instant the door gave, and he had held it low against his thigh, hidden by the fall of his coat, so that when the moment came, he had only to raise his arm. He shot two of the Chicago men in the time it took Walter Kellerman to turn his head. The second thing was Nathaniel. He did not go for his own gun first. He crossed the room in two long strides, and he put his own enormous body between Walter Kellerman and Clara Hawthorne. His arms came up. His back was to his wife. He was a wall of bone and muscle and stubborn Irish faith standing in front of the woman he loved, and he did not flinch even as Walter pulled the trigger. The bullet struck him in the left shoulder, the same shoulder a Kellerman had put a bullet through 10 years ago. The third thing was Clara. She did not scream. She did not faint. She caught her husband as he staggered back into her, and she eased him down to one knee, and with her right hand she drew the small pistol from her hip, and she placed herself at his side. Silas had already hit three more of the Chicago men. The gunfight in the narrow hotel room was close and loud, and over faster than a person would believe. Silas took a bullet in the thigh and went down on one knee of his own, but he kept shooting, and Walter Kellerman's men began to fall, the way summer grass falls under the scythe. Down in the lobby, then on the stairs, a long rifle opened up. Clean space shots unhurried, never wasted. Fired from cover, from a rest against a wall, at a steady, careful distance. Elias. He had heard the first volley from half a mile away as he was settling Cornelius Bennett into the Morrison cabin. He had left Sarah with the old man. He had taken up the long rifle, the one weapon his stiff shoulder could still fire true at distance, and he had ridden hard for the hotel. A rifle from the cover of a stairwell was a different thing from a pistol in a close room, and Elias knew the difference as well as any man alive. He laid his shots with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world, and the last two of Walter Kellerman's men fell before they ever reached the top of the stairs. Judge Harrison was behind his writing desk, now down on the floor, clutching the papers against his chest as if they were a child he was hiding from the cold. Clara stayed low beside her husband. She pressed her hand against Nathaniel's shoulder where the dark flower of blood was spreading under his shirt. His eyes found hers, and his mouth, pale and tight, moved into the shape of a smile. "Wife," he said, "I am all right." "You are not all right. You are shot." "Only a little." "Nathaniel Hawthorne, I swear to God." Across the room, Walter Kellerman had lost his smile. Three of his 6 men were down and not getting up. 2 more were backing into the shattered doorway, and one of those fell suddenly forward as Elias's rifle spoke its final time from the stairwell. Walter himself stood alone now, his pistol still smoking in his hand, and the look on his face was the look of a man watching a story he had been writing for a decade end on a different page than the one he had planned. He lifted the pistol and aimed it again at Clara. "If I cannot have the land," he said very softly, "I will at least have this." Nathaniel did not seem to move. That was the thing Clara would remember for the rest of her life. He did not seem to move, and yet somehow his own revolver was already in his hand, and his arm had come up, and his thumb had drawn back the hammer, and the shot rang out in that small ruined room. It was a single bullet. It took Walter Kellerman just left of the center of his chest. He looked surprised. That was all. He looked mildly, politely surprised, as though someone had told him something at a dinner party that did not quite fit what he had believed about the world. Then his knees gave way beneath him, and he sat down on the floor of room 7 of the Grand Hotel, and then he lay down on his side, and he did not get up again. It was done. Clara was weeping and did not know it. She was pressing both hands against her husband's shoulder now. Silas was dragging himself across the floor to them, leaving a dark trail on the floorboards. Elias came in through the shattered door frame, at last long rifle in his hands, and he looked at his brothers and his sister and the dead men on the floor, and his jaw worked once, and then he set about helping the living. No one else came up the stairs. The war had burned itself out in the space of 3 minutes. Clara, Nathaniel said. His voice was very tired. Clara, listen to me. I am listening. I am here. I am not dying today. Do you hear me? I am not dying today. I have not even properly started loving you yet. Hush, she whispered. Hush, Nathaniel. Save your breath. I will save my breath for the next 60 years, with you. Do you hear me, wife? She laughed. It came out of her broken and wet, and she could not stop it. She laughed, and she pressed her forehead against his, and the blood from his shoulder was soaking into her sleeve. And Elias was already moving towards Silas with bandages, and Silas was already tying off his own wound with a bandana, and Judge Harrison was sitting on the floor behind his desk, saying, thanks be to God, thanks be to God, thanks be to God, over and over like a man who could not think of anything else. 20 minutes later, far out on the East Road out of Cedar Falls, the United States Marshals crested a rise at the gallop. Captain Theodore Brooks had pushed his men hard. He had come a full day ahead of his promised timetable. 15 riders, dust-stained, sun-reddened, their federal stars pinned to their vests. They rode into Cedar Falls at a hard canter. The Chicago men who were still standing took one look at them and began to run, and the marshals rode them down one by one in the street, and by full dark, every last hired gun in the town was either dead or in irons. Captain Brooks climbed the stairs of the Grand Hotel 2 at a time. He shouldered through the broken door frame of room 7. He stopped. Judge Harrison rose from behind the desk, holding the papers out in both hands. Captain Brooks took them, glanced at the top page, and a terrible, tight grief Clara did not understand crossed his weathered face for the space of a heartbeat. Then he looked past the judge to where Clara knelt on the floor beside her wounded husband. He crossed the room. He went down on one knee in front of her. He took off his hat. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said quietly, your Uncle Cornelius was a dear friend of mine going back to the war. He spoke of you in his last letter before he left Chicago. He spoke of you with great pride. He wrote that if anything happened to him, I was to find you, and I was to tell you that he had always been proud to have a niece who would grow up to be the kind of woman who would stand up for the truth. Clara could not answer. She only nodded. He is alive, Mrs. Hawthorne, Brooks said softly. One of my men rode ahead to the Morrison cabin. Your uncle is alive. He is hurt, but he is alive. And now, ma'am, with your permission, I am going to get these 2 brave men to a doctor. Immediately. He stood. He turned to the officer behind him. His voice became the voice of a commander. Get Mr. Hawthorne and Mr. Silas Hawthorne to the clinic. Now, any man in this town who blocks your path, you put in irons with the others. 2 days later, in the small whitewashed clinic at the end of Cedar Falls, Nathaniel Hawthorne opened his eyes. Clara was sitting in a wooden chair beside his bed. Her hands were folded in her lap around her mother's silver cross. Elias was dozing in the corner. Silas, his leg heavily bandaged, was playing cards, one-handed with Sarah Morrison, who had refused to go anywhere else since the marshals had brought her grandfather's old friend Cornelius Bennett to the same clinic the night before. Nathaniel looked at Clara for a long time before he spoke. Wife, he said, I believe I promised you 60 years. Clara made a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob, and she pressed her face against the back of his uninjured hand. Captain Brooks returned that afternoon. He stood in the doorway, turning his hat in his hands, and he spoke in a gentle voice because he had been a soldier long enough to understand that there were some battles a person won by being gentle. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said, among the papers your uncle sent me before he left Chicago, there was an item I think you have a right to know about. It is a copy of your father's actual will, the Reverend Josiah Whitmore, filed with a probate attorney in Boston on a date 1 week before his death. He was not bankrupt, ma'am. Pemberton forged the debt. Your father left behind a modest savings, about $5,000 in a small house in Boston. All of it was left to you. Clara said nothing for a long moment. She turned her head and looked at Nathaniel. He was looking back at her. $5,000, Nathaniel said dryly. Well, it appears I married up wife. Do not be foolish, she said, and she was smiling and crying at the same time. It is not my money. It is ours, and I know exactly what we are going to do with it. Do you now? We are going to build a school, Nathaniel, here in Cedar Falls. A school for young women so that no girl will ever again stand on an auction block in this town or any town for the want of an education and a choice. And we are going to call it the Lily Hawthorne Academy. It was one of the very few times in his life Nathaniel Hawthorne wept where other people could see him. In the weeks that followed, Cedar Falls was turned inside out. Judge Harrison convened his court in the town's biggest church because the courthouse was not large enough to hold the crowds. The ledgers of Harold Pemberton and Walter Kellerman were read aloud page by damning page. Land titles stolen over a decade of fraud were returned to the families who had owned them. Foreclosed homes were put back into the hands of their rightful people. Father Mackenzie, the old priest, stood in his own pulpit one Sunday morning and wept and asked the forgiveness of every family he had failed by performing those auction weddings in the first place. Sarah Morrison's first marriage to a man who had knowingly taken an underage girl coerced by fraud was quietly annulled by Judge Harrison and Chambers. She stayed on with the Hawthornes for the summer. She would marry 2 years later a good young dairy farmer named Isaac Hayward, though that was not the match that shaped her life most deeply. Cornelius Bennett did not go back to Chicago. He sold his law practice by post, bought a small white clapboard house on the edge of Cedar Falls, and hung out his shingle as the town's new attorney. He insisted against all protest on being present at every meal the Hawthornes ate for the rest of his days. And the Hawthorne brothers. Nathaniel, once he had healed, was elected sheriff of Cedar Falls by a unanimous show of hands at the next town meeting. The beast of Elkhorn Ridge, the whispered killer the man mothers had warned their children about, became the keeper of law and order in the very town that had once feared him. He wore the badge with a quiet astonishment that never entirely left him. Elias opened a furniture shop on Main Street where he built chairs and tables and cedar chests that were within 2 years famous across 3 territories. A bride in Helena who wanted an Elias Hawthorne cedar chest as her wedding gift was considered a fortunate woman indeed. Silas went back to the high country. He remained a guide and a hunter, and the best tracker Elkhorn Ridge had ever seen. He also began very slowly to ride down to Cedar Falls on Sunday afternoons, always on some pretext, always with his rifle clean and his shirt clean, and always he found himself sitting a little closer to Sarah Morrison on the Hayward family porch. When Sarah was 18 and her first marriage finally and fully dissolved by the federal court, he asked her with great formal Hawthorne nervousness if he might court her properly. She said yes before he had even finished the sentence. They married the following spring. Isaac Hayward himself stood up with Silas as best man because the dairy farmer had been a good and honest friend to Sarah in a season when she had needed a friend and not a husband, and he had understood from the start that her heart had been promised elsewhere. And on the front porch of the big log house up on the mountain in the July of the year that followed Walter Kellerman's death, Clara Hawthorne sat in a rocking chair Elias had built for her, with her hand resting on the round, warm shape of her belly 7 months along. Nathaniel sat beside her, with his arm along the back of her chair. Below them in the meadow, Silas was working a young horse in the corral, his bad leg a little stiff still. Cornelius Bennett was dozing in a chair on the far side of the porch with the Cedar Falls newspaper folded across his face. "What are you thinking, wife?" Nathaniel asked. "I am thinking," Clara said softly, "that 1 year ago I stood on an auction block in a stolen wedding dress. And now I sit here, with you, with a family, with a child coming, with a whole future." He kissed the top of her honey gold head. Their first child, a little girl, was born in the small hours of a September morning. They named her Lily Mercy Hawthorne. Lily for the sister Nathaniel had lost. Mercy for his mother. She was the first of 3. Now back in the year 1920, an old man laid his pipe down on the arm of his rocking chair. The fire in the stone hearth had burned down to a bed of red coals. Outside, the cold had deepened. The wind had died. Clara had come in from the orchard some time ago and was working in the kitchen with their daughter-in-law, and the soft sounds of her laughter came through the half-open door, like music coming from a room that was very far away and very close at the same time. Caleb Hawthorne, 17 years old, sat on the wooden bench with his eyes shining. "Grandpa," he said softly, "that is the most wonderful story I have ever heard in my life." The old man smiled. "It is a true story, grandson, every word of it. What happened to Great-Uncle Elias?" "Your Great-Uncle Elias passed in his sleep the year you were 11, in the furniture shop he had built. He was sanding a cradle for one of the Hayward grandchildren. He sat down in his chair to rest for a moment, and he closed his eyes, and he simply went home to his mother and his father and his sister Lily. It was a good death, the kind a man prays for." "And Great-Uncle Silas?" "Your Great-Uncle Silas is sitting on the porch of his cabin out on the old Morrison land this very evening with your Great-Aunt Sarah, who has been his wife for 27 years. I had coffee with him Tuesday. He still rides up to the high country every summer. He says the ridge keeps him honest." "And Grandma?" The old man turned his head. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see her. She was 51 years old. Her hair was threaded with silver. Her cheeks were still round and soft and flush pink from the cold, and her blue eyes still caught the lamplight in exactly the way they had caught the stained glass in the Cedar Falls church all those years ago. She looked up at that very moment as if she had felt him watching her, and she smiled at him across the distance of 2 rooms and 29 years of marriage. "Grandma," Nathaniel said, "is going to outlive me, as she should." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at his hands. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" "Anything, grandson." "I am scared about Oregon. I do not know the people. I do not know if I will make a living. I do not know if I will find someone. I do not know if I will be the kind of man you have been." The old rancher studied his grandson for a long moment. Then he leaned forward in his rocking chair and he put a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder, and he spoke in the steady, low voice that had once upon a time quieted a terrified Boston girl on a mountain trail. "Caleb, listen to me. Real love does not come to a man when he goes looking for it. It comes to him when he needs it most. I did not go looking for your grandmother. I rode down off a mountain one morning because a 16-year-old girl I barely knew asked me to stop an injustice. God put your grandmother in that church at that hour for reasons I will not understand until I see him face to face. You go to Oregon, you work hard, you keep your word. You live according to the honor of the Hawthorne name, which is the only inheritance any of us really have. And the woman God has for you will find you at the hour she is supposed to find you. You have my word on that." Caleb's eyes were wet. He threw his arms around his grandfather's neck, and the old man, after a moment, put his arm around the boy and held him as his own father had once held him, as his mother had once held him, as Clara Hawthorne had held their daughter Lily on the day she was born. "I love you, Grandpa. I love you too, boy. Now go and give your grandmother a proper goodbye before supper. She has been saving cobbler for you all afternoon." Caleb rose. He wiped his face on his sleeve. He crossed the room, paused in the kitchen doorway, and then disappeared into the bright warmth of the room beyond. The old man heard Clara laugh low and rich, and then call out something affectionate to the boy, and the warm sound of her voice came rolling through the doorway and wrapped itself around Nathaniel like a familiar coat. He sat alone by the fire for a little while longer. He looked at the photograph over the mantel. Clara in her borrowed white dress holding her bouquet of wildflowers, 22 years old when it had been taken. Though she had never quite looked her age even then, and she did not quite look 51 now. She had always somehow looked exactly like Clara. He picked up his pipe. He tapped the cold ash into the hearth. He did not relight it. "Almost time for supper, old man," he said to himself softly. "Almost time." He rose. His knees were not what they had been. His left shoulder was stiff, the way it had been stiff for 30 years since the day the boy named Walter Kellerman had put a bullet through it to stop him from loving his wife. His right hand, the hand that had fired the shot that ended Walter a minute and a half later, was a little curled with arthritis now and did not quite close all the way on the handle of the pipe. He did not mind any of it. He walked to the kitchen doorway. He stood in it for a moment watching her. Clara was at the stove, her back to him, stirring something in a cast iron pot. Their daughter-in-law was laughing at something Caleb had said. The lamplight fell on his wife's silver-streaked hair and on the soft, sweet line of her cheek. As if she felt him there, she turned. Her eyes met his across the room. After 29 years, the look in her eyes was still the look she had given him that morning in the Cedar Falls church when a mountain man she had never seen before had kissed her in front of 100 witnesses and bought her freedom with 10 years of saved gold. It was a look of trust that was absolute and of love that had never once through 3 children in a dozen hard winters in the slow graying of their hair run shallow. He held her eye. He smiled. She smiled back. Outside, the wind rose once in the pines on the ridge and then settled as though even the mountain were turning in for the evening. And that, friends, is the story of how a full-figured male order bride from Boston, a mountain man who had not seen a woman in 10 years, and the 2 most loyal brothers who ever drew breath together, wrote the longest and truest love story that the country around Elkhorn Ridge, Montana ever saw. It was not perfect. It was real. And it stood on 3 things that never grow old and never lose their worth in any century: honor, family, and faith.